Welcome, everybody. Happy Tuesday afternoon. Well, I'm hoping it's Tuesday afternoon for most of you. If not, good morning. Either way, we started the week yesterday. It's not Monday, so we're in better shape. But thank you all for joining us for a behavior analyst talks about diversity and its ethical implications for today's session. And during the next 2-ish hours, you're going to have the chance to earn CEUs. And the way that you'll earn those CEUs is by making sure that you join with your unique link that was emailed you or emailed to you about, let's see, about an hour ago, actually. And the reason why I say that's a unique link is because that join webinar button, if you were to forward that to, say, a coworker, a family member, or a friend, then they will be logging in as you. That is specific to your email and name and basically your entire data that's going to end up happening over here today. But also the way that you'll earn these poll questions is by earn your CEUs is by answering the poll questions that are going to be popping up on your screen. So make sure that you use that link so this way you are joined properly. If you've dialed in audio only, GoToWebinar is not going to be able to register your attendance, and we will have no idea that you were here or any participation whatsoever. So please, even if you have technical difficulties, make sure that you are signing in with that join webinar button, even if you have to have it just way in the background or something like that. But all right, go ahead. Put your questions that you have in the questions box today. I sent out a copy of the handout a couple of hours ago. If you didn't get it, then you can download it underneath the handout section of the control panel, or you can send us an email to support@bds.com and we'll attach it there for you. But I'll go into more detail about CEUs and purchasing and all of that good stuff when the first poll question pops up. So I'm going to shut myself down and turn it over to Charlie.
Okay, well, greetings everyone. So this is a continuing series in which we've been covering a lot of different topics, some of them edgier than others, a range of things that we behavior analysts do pay attention to, but some we haven't been thinking of over the years as being as central to what we do as behavior analysts. And so this is an opportunity to explore the ways in which our discipline can reach out further and further into the things that are going on about the world. We have more coming up. We'll be talking about climate change next month, for example. So diversity is in a way, it's now, this is roughly in the center of the series. You haven't seen it come up yet, but we're actually going to extend this series into the spring. So there'll be a few new topics listed at the BDS website fairly soon, and you'll be able to find out about those. But in the meantime, today we're talking about diversity and also its ethical implications. I will do what I've usually done with most of these to say that some content might be disturbing or offensive to some people. I never can really be sure. Those kinds of things are changing over time. But since we're talking about issues involving race and ethnicity and gender and those sorts of topics, I hope you will find that none of what we have to say about it is terribly bothersome. I've been drawing a lot of the background for what I've been discussing from my book, The ABCs of Behavior Analysis. And just so you know, if for that reason you get interested in it, my publisher, Sloan Publishing, does offer a discount, and on that page is some information about how you would go about getting that. So we have this triumvirate, DEI. For a long while, I didn't know what it meant. De in Italian means gods, but with the apostrophe S in some uses, or plural in others. But now we all pretty much know diversity comes first in the list. But as we will see, it is really central. It is the most important, I think, of those three terms. And another name for diversity is variability. And so we find it not just in social characteristics of people and so forth. We find it in biological systems. For example, as we'll see later, conservation biology has studied populations of fish, lakes in the Midwest. Their populations similar in form, but different in their genetic range of variation in their genotypes. And given environmental stress, those with the broader range of genotypes actually come off better with climate change and other things than those with a narrower range. And that's a consequence of diversity, which we're going to explore in a little bit more detail later on. That particular example is an example of diversity at the phylogenic level. And as we've been doing throughout these talks, I've often been dropping back and reminding us all that we actually worry about selection, which is the key to our science, as is involved in shaping. But we have to worry about selection at the level of phylogeny, like in Darwinian selection. But we also worry about selection of behavior within the lifetime of the individual organism, as we do in shaping, call that ontogenic selection. And then if we move on to the level of cultural practices, lots of us might be tempted to think in terms of Dawkins' memes, and people have talked about memetics as a science, but memes are not really well defined, but behavior is. So when we talk about selection at what we call the cultural or sociogenic level, we're talking about behavior being passed on from some individuals to other. You can teach somebody to cook some ethnic dish, even though they're not members of that particular ethnic group. And so that behavior can be passed on among individuals. So again and again and again, and not just today, but in other presentations, some that are already have been presented, which, by the way, continue to be available if some of you would ever want to go back and look at any of them again. If you go to the BDS site, you'll find that you can, for the older presentations, you can go look at them via YouTube by clicking on the links that are provided there. But again and again and again, we'll talk about phylogenic selection, or selection of behavior at the level of passing it on from one organism to the next, and evolutionary changes over evolutionary time. We'll talk about ontogenic selection, or the selection of operant behavior as it is selected by its consequences within the lifetime of the individual organism. And we'll talk about behavior being passed on from some individuals to others in what we now find conveniently labeled sociogenic selection. So variable behavior provides advantages not just in phylogeny, but also in ontogeny and also in sociogeny. And we're going to be looking at that. We'll discuss the ways in which education and political and other institutions can either enhance variations or suppress them. And we're living in times in which it's so easy to find examples. Right now, what teachers can do in the classroom is being clearly suppressed, not just in totalitarian countries, not only in the things that Putin is doing in Russia to make sure that the Russian school kids are being taught about what's happening in Ukraine from a very specific Russian point of view, but it's happening in the schools here in this country as books are being banned and teachers are finding it difficult to even hold their jobs sometimes if they're trying to teach certain kinds of topics. So variation at all three levels. And when I talk about all three levels, I'm talking about the point in which you could even get people trying to change their populations through murder. So we could use, and we could look at examples: Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, and contemporary Russia under Putin. Now, what I'm going to do is a little bit tricky because we're talking about what we know about variations. And what I want to suggest is that these things we know may be some of the things that allow us to defend diversity, and maybe to do so at each of these levels of selection. But this is something we have to think through and worry about, and I'll be addressing some of the directions I've been taking and worrying about these issues as we proceed today. So here we go, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Um, what are the inverses of those words? Well, on the other side of diversity, you have conformity, stereotypy. Um, it's curious. Some people who have criticized behavior analysis have argued that, well, what reinforcement does is it produce stereotype behavior, because once you reinforce it, you get the same behavior over and over again. Fortunately, we can counter those kinds of arguments these days by pointing to some beautiful research, for example, by Alan Nuringer, showing that variability itself as a dimension of behavior can be reinforced. And that is another thing we'll talk about. Well, the other dimensions, equity, obviously the inverse is inequity, and we can appeal to a world in which things are balanced and equal. And so once we're dealing with things where people can accumulate stuff like property and money, that kind of balance becomes really, really difficult to influence. And of course, we know that in politics, there's a lot trying to influence diversity. We've seen what's happened as the Supreme Court has made some of its decisions with respect to affirmative action and diversity within universities and among students. Inclusion, well, obviously the opposite is exclusion. And there is still some argument that there ought to be some opportunities for certain kinds of groups to be able to include only certain people and membership. If we didn't have some bases for that, could there ever be groups that were organized themselves exclusively on the grounds of gender, or relatives who get together just on the grounds of their having a very close genetic relationship? Um, these are all thorny issues, and trying to draw boundaries between things that are, as we again argued, things that are continua. Um, that is always a difficult matter. So back to the distinctions in the evolution of biological systems and phylogenic selection, the evolution of classes of behavior as in shaping, cultural practices as in sociogenic selection. Populations can change only if they're variable. That is, they've got to be diverse. If you don't have some differences, you can't do any shaping. So therefore, diversity is crucial. Evolution can't occur if we don't have diversity. So we're going to explore these at each level. Another little point about this that's worth making, I think, is that at each of these levels for us, it's behavior that gets selected. In fact, even at the level of evolutionary systems, we may have been taught, it's species that get selected. Even in some specialized ways of thinking, it's organ systems, so that certain kinds of kidneys, certain kinds of lungs, circulatory systems, all of these things were selected too, as well as the populations that we call species, which are mainly names for convenience. That, by the way, agrees with what Darwin had to say too. But at every one of those levels, what's crucial is behavior. Because if you're talking about evolutionary times, the organisms that survive only because of what they can do. If you cannot eat, if you cannot find water, if you cannot avoid your predators, if you cannot find mates, if you cannot stick together with your social group, if you have a lot of social interactions, those are all things that are kinds of behavior, and everything else about us, our anatomies, our nervous system has evolved in the service of producing our behavior. Our skeletal system is in support of muscles, the movement of which are a huge part of our behavior. All of those parts of us evolved in the service of what we can do. So at the level of phylogeny, it's pretty obvious at the level of ontogeny that we're always talking about the selection of behavior when we talk about shaping, but also at the level of social behavior and ethnic practices and all sorts of other dimensions. It's behavior all the way down. So given all that, let's stop for a poll question so you folks can get a little practice on doing these. Over to you, Marissa.
Alrighty, everybody. So a blue box should have popped up on your screen. You should be able to select an answer and lock it in with that submit button. Please do not put your participation for these poll questions into the questions box. It's a lot easier when having to analyze all the data to just go in and see them all pretty easily just because there's quite a few people in here. So should there be a lot of questions and feedback, it's just a little bit easier. If you do have trouble with that interface and you can't submit your poll questions, go ahead and write them in like a body of an email or a Word document, and you can send them to me after the webinar, and that will be perfect for your participation. But alrighty, if you did not purchase CEUs yet, that's okay. You have basically you can do it whenever, but we will, if you want instant access to your certificate, I recommend purchasing before tomorrow morning. I will be analyzing all this data in the morning, and you'll get your certificate instructions by lunchtime. If you only need a certificate of completion, that's going to come a few hours after we end here today, and it's free of charge. You don't have to purchase anything. But all right, let's shut down this poll. And it looks like, wow, 2% say deprivation, 3% say differentiation, 3% say discrimination, and 92% say diversity.
Okay, well, good for the 92%. Okay, so let's now move on. Let me just say a little bit personal, something personal about diversity. I've now had my DNA done, actually more than one DNA thing. This is a map of the most recent thing coming from one of the sources that does these kinds of analyses. Now, my last name is Catania, which is actually the name of a city that sits, if you can see my cursor, it's in the Mediterranean down here, and it's a little island off the toe of Italy. And the city of Catania sits at the foot of Mount Etna. By the way, if you go to that city, you will not find a lot of people named Catania. You will find them uh, in an area around that. That's a typical thing, although it's been diffused now that people travel so much. In the old days, when names were not so formal as they are now, somebody would leave a place and other people would say, well, who are you? Well, I'm Joe from New York or something like that. Or I'm Giuseppe di Catania, which would mean I'm Joseph from the city of Catania. You'll find that all over the world where you find peoples whose names come from places, that the places themselves don't have the highest density of the name. It's places nearby when they identify themselves as coming from there that have the high density of the name. But the point about this is, yeah, the percentages are pretty low. Some of my ancestry is in Italy itself. Actually, the Sicilian line is on my father's side, and the mainland Italian line is from my mother's side. But look at all the rest. I've got some genetic origins in North Africa, some way up in Scandinavia, in Sweden and Denmark. I've got some in France and some in Greece, and in the um, moving toward the Middle East, some in Spain. From Spain probably accounts for some of my Jewish genes because there was a great migration away from Spain to escape from the Spanish Inquisition. The Jews who call themselves Merinos, some stayed and began to practice Catholicism. And Sicily was a source of those people who left Spain. I also know that Sicily, being an island in the middle of the Mediterranean, it always had other populations coming through. And in fact, there is evidence that the Vikings did get into the Mediterranean, and the Vikings visited not just Great Britain and Ireland and Iceland and places up in the north, but they visited Sicily as well. And so Sicily itself is a diverse population. And it may be that the Sicilian language evolved because it was a way in which the Sicilians would speak to each other and be able to have a language that those passersby who came through would not be able to pick up too easily. So, for example, the Sicilian dialect includes some Arabic words in it. Um, so if you're speaking basic Italian, you might find it hard to understand the Sicilian dialect. So anyway, my genes represent a fair amount of diversity. Now it's pretty much limited to this part of the world. Um, uh, I don't have much in the way of Asiatic connections and so on, but this is probably true about an awful lot of us. Over time, there's always been mixes of populations, and some are more or less variable than others. But this just is to mention that we all share these kinds of things. Now, why are these different contributions important? Our science, we say, is the science of the individual organism. Is there something about variability or about diversity that actually makes it more likely than massive stereotypy? So let's consider an example. We know that among a large range of primates, primate mothers hear the noises that their infants make. So the mother chimpanzee hears the baby chimp. The mother gorilla hears the baby gorilla. And of course, human mothers also hear their child's cries. And um, one of the things that we know is the case with just about all primates is that there's enough variation in the sounds that the infants make and the conditions under which they make them that a mother can single out her child's noises from the noises of the children of other primate mothers. Um, and so this can only happen if you've got a variation in the population of infants. If all of the infants sounded alike, if they sounded as much alike as all those ducklings you see out, and you see the ducklings following the mother duck, and you hear them quacking, I think you'd need to spend a lot of time with those ducklings to be able to identify particular ones of them. But consider it, you can pick up the phone and someone you know can start talking to you, and after just a couple of words, you know who they are. We have become remarkably sensitive to small differences in the sound frequencies, and not just which word is being said, but the overtones. We mostly tell the difference between a man's voice and a woman's voice, and that's because they have different ranges of overtones because of differences in the vocal apparatus. But I learned to identify that particular person. Now, if it was important in the survival over decades and centuries and millennia, in the evolution of all of these different primate groups, if it was always helpful for the mother to identify her infant, then there was a selection in favor of making sure that some of their features were different enough that she could pick that infant out from all of the others. The same thing presumably happens when you have penguins who leave and they come to these huge areas in which all the penguins are raising their young together, and they can pick out their mate, they can pick out their particular infant. So I presume that penguins too have features. Maybe they're not all vocal. Maybe there are other ones involving looks and feather arrangements and so forth. But wherever you have any kind of selection for where it's important for individuals in a population to identify specific ones, that in itself means that there's a selection that favors variations that allow the individuals to be identified. And this one I picked out because it's one that's we know about with respect to us. And you can sort of, if you start thinking about how that could happen, you have variations in the capacity, the auditory capacity of the mothers. Some are are a little bit more sensitive to some frequencies than others. So the ones who are best at it and who are best at keeping track of their offspring are the ones who are more likely to produce subsequent generations. And so their discrimination of auditory stimuli is going to get sharper and sharper. And as that happens, then changing vocalizations can be shaped by the maternal behavior directed toward the infant. So what you have is kind of the opposite of what is called an arms race. And people who talk about evolution, they talk about the predator getting better and better at catching the prey, but then the prey become better and better at escaping the predator. And so therefore the predator again has to get better and better, which in turn makes the prey get better and better. And between the two of them, they're constantly upping the ante. And so these drive evolution into more and more sophisticated ways in which the prey can elude the predator and the predator can capture the prey. Well, here they're working together. The mother's auditory capacity gets more and more sophisticated, and the infant vocalizations can get more and more varied. And these things will involve in a coevolution of auditory capacity on the part of the mother and vocal differentiation on the part of the offspring. And you end up with really sophisticated things. And hey, we can be amazed at how sophisticated our echoic behavior is, but it's this long kind of evolutionary line that got us where we are. So, what am I arguing then here? Mainly, diversity is good. Hey, this is better than being an economist and arguing that greed is good. Given what we know about biology, and I'm reading it, in the long run, hybrid vigor will always win out over white supremacy or any other kind of supremacy you want to name. Now, what is hybrid vigor? I suspect some of you have heard about it, others haven't. When you're talking about breeding animals, particularly pets, when you're talking about growing plants, vegetables or flowers or whatever, people in agriculture, people who have been involved in animal husbandry, they've known for a long, long time that a very narrowly selected breed is often more susceptible to disease, to various kinds of genetic problems than one that includes a lot of mongrels, a lot of hybrids, mutts. Among dogs, you get the two dogs that just sort of happen to meet out there and produce offspring. That's very different from animal dog breeders breeding an animal to compete in dog shows. And what you find is that some breeds have been like the ones with very short snouts end up having respiratory problems because the selective breeding has led to much less variation in that part of their respiratory system. And even among humans, we know over the long run that interbreeding can create problems. The Romanovs, in the history of the Tsars in Russia, one of the things that happened because there was a lot of inbreeding at the level of people who were in that level of control over the in the Russian royalty, carried hemophilia. As you started bleeding, and the bleeding didn't stop. The clotting factor was a problem, and so that was a consistent problem of inbreeding. The inverse of inbreeding is hybrid vigor. The more variable the population, the less likely you are to have recessive stuff show up, and disadvantageous genes survive in a population. And I'm contrasting that for white supremacists. The white supremacists ought to know enough about biology to know that they're disadvantaging themselves if they want to keep their gene pool narrow. And of course, they have whatever mythology they have with respect to what that gene pool ought to be. Some of them are sometimes shocked by finding out that they have in their ancestry a variable gene pool that looks maybe even less variable than mine, but even if it was just a little bit like mine, it would probably worry them. Uh, and as some people who have talked about racial issues have said, and I don't remember whether this is in Malcolm X or not, in the days when one drop of black blood was enough to get a person called black, any kind of mixture was disparaged by certain white communities. Um, what this particular individual said was, well, if all it takes is one drop of black blood to make a person not white anymore, that's got to be mighty powerful blood. Well, anything that contributes to hybrid vigor is a good thing. And so teach that to any white supremacist you run into, although they might not want to listen to you. So let's now move on to talking about some contingencies. We're going to be jumping back and forth between the phylogenic and the ontogenic and the sociogenic stuff. Let's talk a little bit about social contingencies now, because we often discuss social contingencies, and we as behavior analysts, we come to the point where we've seen the problems created by aversive control. We've seen how aversive contingencies creates side effects that of behavior that competes with the behavior we want to reinforce. So we argue that we should use positive reinforcement wherever possible. We should avoid aversives. That, even though we live in a country now where in some states it's okay for teachers to spank their kids using paddles. In something, I think there's at least a dozen states now in which that's still illegal. And we should regard that as primitive behavior, but teachers do it in some places. And so aversive contingencies, we can say we don't want to use them, we recommend against them, but they are pervasive. They're around everywhere in the world. And in part that may be because verbal behavior also it's easy to get somebody to use these techniques. So we tend to think most about how we can create a world in which the emphasis is on positive reinforcers, but we live in a world in which the way things are being done involve coercive political regimes. We got national international legal systems. Almost all the legal stuff involves punishment of some kind or others. Very little legal stuff involves reinforcing desirable behavior. You don't give people awards for good driving. You give them tickets when they do something wrong. And then you got war. I mean, you do this or we'll kill you. And these all depend on aversive contingencies, and we can't neglect that. And that's a problem because, for some of us, just looking at the way some of these things work is itself aversive. But you put all that together and it makes you wonder, can we derive some of the properties of human ethical systems from these kinds of aspects of variation selection, the thing I've been talking to so far, that determine whether cultures survive? And again, I'm hammering this away. You've heard it a couple of times already. I'll say it again. We've made the observation that across all these three varieties of selection, whether phylogenic or ontogenic or sociogenic, populations, classes that include wide ranges of variation, are more likely to adapt to changing environments than those that involve restricted ranges of variation. So shouldn't an emphasis on things that allow behavior to survive be something which could be the basis for ethical properties? Throughout this all, we're particularly concerned, and maybe it's in part because we can do something with it, with the survival of cultural practices, one of which is the teaching of this stuff we call behavior analysis. And those things will survive not only because selection operates, but also what's the range of variations on which the selection can operate. And so I am suggesting this is thoroughly tied in with issues of ethics. Here's another poll question for you, having said that much. Let's see where you go with this. Over to you, Marissa.
All right, everybody. So the argument so far is that the key to behavioral ethics is given by aversive contingencies, variation in selection, inclusion but not equity, and stimulus control, or I should say, or stimulus control.
Okay, I hope this is an easy question.
Great. Thank you all for voting so quickly. I will shut this down. Please make sure you do participate in these poll questions if you wish to earn CEUs. Not answering enough poll questions could disqualify you. Alrighty. Looks like 26% say aversive contingencies, 63% say variation in selection, 7% say inclusion but not equity, and 4% say stimulus control.
Okay, I can actually now see that maybe that first one is, I did often enough say that aversive contingencies produce problems, and that would be a basis then for making ethical, making that an ethical consideration. So probably that one should not have been available as the alternatives. But so those of you who pick either the aversive stuff or the variation selection, consider that you got that one. Okay, moving on. A personal note. I thought I'd tell you a little bit more about how I got into worrying about some of these things. I was an undergraduate in my freshman year, still kind of learning my way, beginning to see that the criteria for doing okay in a course were different at the college level than they were when I was a high school student. And I got into this one course in which I was supposed to write an essay, and somehow or other, I don't know whether it was a choice I made or whether it was an assigned topic, but I wrote an essay on the survival of cultures, on ethical issues in cultures. And I argued that an irreducible prerequisite for any culture would be its survival. And I got a low grade for that essay. Now, maybe the sentences were not clear and all that, but I was really disappointed because I thought it was a sensible argument that, if cultures don't survive, why should one talk about whether they had ethics or not, if they're not even around anymore? And years later, I ran across one of Skinner's papers in which he made the same kind of case. And of course, if you find yourself saying something that's similar to something that Skinner has said, that's got to be a bit of a reinforcer. And so I kept on coming back to the issue. Not only that, but and occasionally I put myself in a situation where I would give a talk involving ethics and cultures and things like that. And the ultimate inspiration under those circumstances is the deadline. So these combinations of contingencies brought me back to these questions, including the deadline to getting this stuff prepared for today's presentation. So timing matters. For me, as I look back at my move toward being more and more concerned about positive reinforcers as part of the behavior analytic community, I think about what the world has been like during which I grew up. I grew up during World War II. I was a little kid, but by the end of it, I was old enough to have some sense of what was going on. I recall the tensions of the Cold War, and then the Korean War came along. There was the Vietnam War, and then the wars in the Middle East, and we've had Afghanistan and civil wars in Africa. We've had China and Taiwan lately facing off, and right now we've got the Ukraine fighting Russia. This is all our history. And so timing really does matter. Let's see, excuse me. And actually, well, never mind. So what is the topic of ethics all about, though? I mean, let's talk about the way most people talk about it. I've been talking about it in terms of variations of selection. But what does it really mean for things to be good or bad, to be right or wrong, sinless, sinful, blessed, evil? How about the difference between ethics and morals? You've got divine commands, and they're supposed to be absolute, but as soon as you get into cultural relativism, you could start to be persuaded that maybe there are no anchors for any of this stuff at all. So in trying to pursue this, we've also got to look about the ways in which people have talked about these sorts of things in the past. We've got to pay a little bit of attention to philosophy. ethics has typically been regarded as a specialty of it. So the philosophers talk about descriptive ethics, which are the morals. What do the people actually do? Prescriptive ethics is when you're told what to do. And by the way, that distinction corresponds nicely to a distinction that also exists with respect to grammar. You know, you can describe grammars, which is this is how people talk, or you could say what counts as a grammatical sentence or not. And then you can do an analysis of the overall things. And I guess we're more involved in that level of things. Um, Maybe we could say that ethics is to morals as language is to verbal behavior. But that's probably for another talk about a different set of issues. So, so we come into it with this long history and philosophy of various ethical things, and Skinner comes along, and he begins to talk about ethics as well. At the end of World War II, he wrote his book Walden Two, and he wrote later that he saw it as offering something to all of these young people who were coming back from this terrible war, having gone through horrendous sorts of things. Um, and wanted to offer something about what the world might be. And sort of an optimistic time right after World War II. Um, and so, there was a suggestion that within that was the possibility of an ethics of some sort. And he alludes to it at various points in that book. We'll mention it again later. And he wrote a paper called Compassion and Ethics in the Care of the Retardate. We wouldn't use that term anymore. That vocabulary has evolved through many different variations. But he, in that paper, began to formulate some of the things. And one of the main things he brought up in that particular paper was to talk about feelings not being the basis for ethical behavior. You don't do it because somebody's going to feel bad. You do it over the long run because of the eventual outcomes and consequences for the various things. And toward the end of his life, he did say at a couple of points that what he'd really like to do to top things off was to write a book on a behavioral account of ethics. But he, of course, as we know, he never was able to get to that. Um, so, but so Skinner though does set us up for at least saying that yeah, maybe this is something within our purview. Maybe this is something where we have things to say about it. He also got involved in these kinds of things with respect to verbal behavior, because in his book Verbal Behavior, he was talking about the kinds of things that get engendered by different things that people say. So these are quotes. The page numbers are to the book Verbal Behavior. One can read without guilt much which one could not say for other reasons. The book itself and the act of reading constitute a tolerant situation in which verbal behavior is freely emitted. Um, I don't use certain expletives very often, but if I'm reading a book and I run into the word, I'm going to say it to myself as I encounter it. But I'm not going to feel too guilty about that because the author wrote the word. I didn't. Um, he also says a little bit later, behavior which is emitted often changes the conditions responsible for its strength. Since conditions which make verbal behavior strong are frequently aversive, a person possessing strong verbal behavior may, quote, do something about it. So he's talking about the ways in which in a tolerant situation, more variants are available. Okay, you read a book and you're going to be saying things you never would have said on your own, and so it's giving you unlimited implications. So maybe it's no surprise that governments that want to restrict other kinds of behavior, especially work on restricting speech. And that's what makes it so ominous to see the sorts of things that are going on in places like Texas and Florida. Voting is also speech, and we know that that too is being suppressed in a number of states these days. We are perhaps in a precarious situation, so be politically active, folks. It really could make a difference. So ethics is a human issue. We couldn't address it without verbal behavior any more than we could address religion. So Do we begin by looking at its history? Do we want to consider what the church has said about birth control and abortion? Do we want to worry about religious opinions with respect to the death penalty? Do we want to get into the details about judges who must decide whether they might recuse themselves? If you had this judge who was appointed by a certain president, and there was then a case brought before a court which included this judge, and that case involved the son of the president who appointed this judge, shouldn't that judge recuse himself or herself? Well, himself. Um, we have these things going on right now, and we say they're ethical issues, and they involve the dimensions along which decisions are made. How about doctors who must decide whether to tell the truth about a terminal illness? How about whether a family member should tell the patient or be told? All of these issues about telling the truth also count as ethical issues. And am I going to try to tie this into variations too? Well, I think that is a piece of it. Let's stop. Here's another case in which a personal thing got me into these kinds of issues. A long time ago, I was way overcommitted. I was a journal editor. I was running a lab. I was a department chair. And I had the person who would, in those days, was called a secretary. And it was the days before we had computers and all, when if you needed something typed up, the secretary would get out some pieces of paper, put some carbon paper between the sheets, and type the draft. And if you made a mistake along the way, then what you'd have to do was fix it on each of the 3 or 4 copies. And I had a really incredible secretary back in those days. I'm talking about a long time ago, um, who rarely made mistakes. So this is going to bear on the question of whether you can tell a patient about terminal illness, and whether you should mainly worry about immediate consequences and delayed consequences. One day she came into work, and suddenly all of her typing was filled with typos. Clearly, there was a problem. So once I saw this, I finally decided I just had to ask her what was going on. So I said, well, what's happened? You don't usually make this many mistakes. She told me that the day before, she had gone for her standard medical checkup, and one part of it was a breast examination. But while she was in the waiting room before she went in for her exam, another woman was leaving, and the receptionist at the counter said to her, "Oh, it's so sad. That woman just left. She's got breast cancer, but the doctor hasn't told her yet." Okay, so that's what happened with my secretary. She goes in and sees the doctor, and he tells her she's fine, and she leaves, but she knows that this other woman had left, and the doctor hadn't told the other woman, and she couldn't help but worry that that was the case. I persuaded her that she had to call and check back, and yes, she was persuaded to know she was fine. The doctor had not kept anything from her, and she finally settled down a little bit. Well, I had a friend of mine who actually went into medicine, and we had these debates about whether it's okay to tell a patient when the patient has a terminal illness. And one part of the argument, well, you have to judge whether the patient is ready to receive it. Back in those days, by the way, it was often common not to tell older members of the family that they had cancer, for example. And in those days, it was much more likely to be incurable. Um, Sometimes the doctors would talk to the children of the family, who would then not tell their parents. And this actually happened even with, I had a fairly prominent psychologist who was a colleague of mine, and we were members of the same department for a brief period of time, uh, who, uh, who talked about not telling his father, who was a very sharp person, who I also happen to know, that his father had cancer. And his father died, and they had never talked to each other about it or properly said goodbye to each other because of that. Now, when we worry about these kinds of things, one thing we can do is subject them to a sort of signal detection thing. You know, what happens if you do this? What happens if you don't do it? What are the positive consequences? What are the negative ones? So weighed against the immediate consequences for the person who has this illness of being told, yeah, you've only got so many months to go, are all the delayed ones, like the delayed ones for my secretary, whose next period of time and was agitated up to the point where I persuaded her to call and get more information. And actually, if she hadn't done that, it might have gone on for a longer period of time. All of those who begin not to trust what doctors tell them because they all know that doctors have lied to their members, family members who met had these problems. Now, as soon as you say that there's some things you're not supposed to say, that you can't say this because this person is ready, you're constraining the possible variations that are available. You can judge timing, you can do these other things. But if you now say it's simply immoral or unethical to tell this, what you're doing is limiting the options, and limiting options is a way of limiting variations. So instead, can we, well, you can see what we're on the way to doing. We're trying to look at basic behavioral processes, things involving verbal behavior, and we're wondering, can we derive ethical considerations from those? I suspect that if we polled everybody here, and I could have put this in as a poll question, I suspect that few of us would argue that ethics have been given to us by some divine source. That we'd be worried if somebody was arguing that ethical behavior is verbally governed behavior, but the texts that control that verbal behavior are divinely created. And you know, even within various religious contexts, there have certainly been attempts to derive ethical principles from logic and from other processes. The evolution of Judaic law, many lines of Christian thought, Spinoza. In many of those cases, the resort was to looking at more basic things and to see whether ethics might be a derivative of those other kinds of things. So it's not so unusual for us to do it. It happens that we have a different starting place. We have a science of behavior that didn't exist back in these times. And we have seen that kind of thing happen in biology. William Hamilton was the biologist who came up with kin selection. That is, the problem was, why might you give your life to save somebody else's life? Well, if it turns out to be its family members, part of that might be that you share genes with these other people, so that your genes might be lost if you die, but if you save a certain number of your relatives, you might save more of your genes than you would by saving yourself. And Hamilton actually came up with a quantitative way of looking at those kinds of things. And then E.O. Wilson came along with his sociobiology, and then came along the evolutionary psychologists who started to look at evolutionary contingencies. And so they began to make arguments that ethical behavior emerged from altruistic behavior that was based on phylogenic origins because of the shared gene pool. So you got all these books: Robert Wright's Moral Animal, Paul Bloom's Descartes' Baby, Mike Gazzaniga's Human, Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape. I mean, I could go on and on. It also gets complicated in another way, because there are now debates. It used to be that phylogenic selection was represented as something in which there could not be such a thing as selection at the level of groups. Only individual genes could be selected. And there are now some arguments that dispute that and suggest ways in which groups can be involved in selection as well as just individuals. So all of these kinds of things are going on. So why shouldn't we be joining in the game? So how would our systems rule out aversive contingencies? We still want to be able to deal with the realities of aversive control. We know of dictatorships. We've got Mao Zedong, we've got Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Kim Jong-il. Um, we've had wars in which people have murdered each other. You do what we say, or we're going to come along and we're going to kill you. I did this a while ago, and I forgot to put Ukraine there on the list. Well, what's involved in aversive contingent? Oh, and so should it be the golden rule? I mean, we would like to have do unto others as you would have do unto you, but the rule of the iron fist is do unto others before they do unto you. I kind of prefer the former over the latter. Oh, let's have another poll question. Over to you, Marissa.
Alrighty, so sociobiologists have argued that altruism evolved because of shared genes in the kin selection, hybrid vigor, group selection, or innate emotional behavior.
This is a tougher one than most of them have been, isn't it? Because these are all things we've talked about a little bit one way or another.
And thank you all for voting so quickly. I will shut this down in just a second. Alrighty, here we go. Looks like, 51% said shared genes in kin selection, 16% said hybrid vigor, 18% said group selection, and 16% said innate emotional behavior. I can't talk today. Ooh, sorry guys.
It's a good thing that's not happening to me. Okay, so well, congratulations to 51%. That was a tough question because the others had been recent things in the list, and it's a little bit trickier. So, but thank you for participating, and especially for those of you who got it. But the other folks, I can understand the question was not quite at the same lines as others. So, so what does behavior analysis have to offer as we consider these sorts of things? We know much more about how behavior actually works. So when it comes to questions about using aversives, maybe even about research on aversives, we should be able to make better judgments about the consequences. We should be able to say something about what it does. We also know a lot more about verbal behavior. We have things to contribute there in verbal governance and in correspondences between saying and doing and so forth. So when it comes to questions about the truth, questions about verbal interventions, verbal control by politicians and religious leaders and others, and educators, we may be able to make better judgments about the functions of the different varieties of talk. In fact, educating broadly about behavior and its functions, because that gives people more opportunities, it gives people more control, it gives them the opportunity to push back and provide the resistance to things that would constrain their options, that allow them to be variable. That may be one of our ethical imperatives. It's ethically imperative that we get our science out and we get it spread as broadly as we possibly can. And we should be trying to get it out there, not just to people who are already convinced, but we've got to reach the linguists, we've got to reach the philosophers, we've got to reach the general public. And the more of that we can do, the better we can get at getting things out there, books that reach a broader audience, op-ed pieces. If you run into something in the newspapers in which there's an obvious behavioral response to it, write a letter to the editor, write an op-ed piece. There ought to be lots of those coming in. You're going to run into a problem of low probabilities of reinforcement. If you write a letter to an editor, the editor, there are going to be lots of letters coming in, and you're going to have to go through several tries, and your early efforts might not be successful. Keep it going, keep trying, keep the messages short, keep them simple, include an example, make your letter tell a little story, but try to get them out there, because getting these things out to the public is crucial to the survival and continuation of our science, and maybe to our culture in general. And we've got another thing that works against us. You know, if a parent is using punishers and the kid's doing something the parent doesn't like, so daddy spanks the kid, or the teacher in one of those states in the United States where the teachers can do it spanks the kid, that behavior is likely to start right then, stop right then and there. So the punisher is going to do something to the ongoing kid's behavior, and that change in the kid's behavior is going to be a reinforcer for the person who delivered the punisher, which means that the punishment is easy to teach. And so that's probably why it spread so easily in human cultures. We all know that if you want to take somebody who is just beginning to learn how to do behavior analysis and you're bringing them into, say, your center for the working with kids on the autism spectrum, or you're working with kids who have other kinds of, who are developmentally disadvantaged in some other ways, um, uh, that it takes a while to use the reinforcers. You may deliver a reinforcer today, and it won't be obvious that the behavior you tried to reinforce has increased until you've been at it for a little while. So that means you got to teach the behavior of reinforcement, and it's real easy to teach the behavior of punishment. So no matter how much of an advantage there is to, in the long run, to using reinforcers, it is so easy to teach the other that we start out at a disadvantage, and we've got to overcome that. And the world tells us that that's the case. We see the aversive stuff all over, wherever there are wars, wherever there are coercive governments, whenever there are laws that are based on punishers and not on reinforcers. We know that the procedure of punishment has won out over reinforcement. And so we've got to do everything we can to spread it around. So is there more to it? Well, yeah, we've got lots and lots of problems. So let's talk. We can talk some more about survival. Again, I've said it over and over again. Variations are essential to selection. Darwinism had its own problems. We shouldn't be discouraged because we're having problems. After Darwin died in the 1890s and beyond, books were being published about the death of Darwinism. And to be a Darwinist was to be in a very small minority group. And the reasons were the only kinds of genetics that were around were Mendelian genetics. And Mendel's genetics, with the dominant and recessive genes and all, didn't provide any basis for variations. So the only other theories that had basis for variations were Lamarckism, which is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. There was orthogenesis, which was sort of that the genes sort of had in them a certain kind of structure that gradually grew and evolved. That, by the way, was the basis for Piaget's developmental psychology. He said he had studied evolution, but he didn't study Darwinian evolution. He studied orthogenesis, which had different origins, had different implications. So his account of child development is actually a lot like orthogenic evolution. We see it more recent. Not until the 1920s when when geneticists began to study. First of all, they discovered an organism they could work with very quickly, the fruit fly, the Drosophila. And they also, once they started doing that, they could come up with quantitative data on mutation. And they could study that because the Drosophila went through many, many generations quickly within a reasonable part of the human lifetime. And so by the 1920s, they come up with mutation theory, and that is where the variation came from that Darwinism needed in order to survive. Well, where do you go from there? Then came what was called the grand synthesis, putting together the new genetics with Darwinian selection, and that became the driving force for the progress in Darwinian selection in phylogenic selection over the remaining part of the century. And of course, as you know, we still have problems with it. There are still places in the United States where teachers will be discouraged from teaching that. You have to worry about all this thing about homeschooling, and you wonder whether they get any decent education with respect to evolution with the kids who are homeschooled, many of which organized with curricula arranged by religious organizations. In our time, we had a similar challenge, because when Chomsky challenged Skinner's verbal behavior, part of it was that Chomsky claimed that Skinner had no way of talking about how the child could come up with a novel sentence. Or, in other words, he was saying that Skinner had no way of saying where the novelty would come up or the variations. And of course, we now have a lot of different ways of talking about sources of novel behavior. So we do have a response to that Chomskyan challenge. And you could say then that what's been happening to us since the 50s, getting to now, in catching up with those kinds of things, is that we're coming out of an eclipse of our variety of selection that is analogous to what happened with the eclipse of Darwinism from the late part of the 19th century to the 1920s. In both of those cases, sources of a novelty, or in other words, the sources of variations, were the issue. So this pervades everything we do. Variability and selection go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. Once you got variability, the rest just about has to happen. The world is built that way. And I think it's relevant that Walden 2 was about, it wasn't about any particular way. You know, Skinner was criticized by some for Walden 2. Some reviewers at the time found it a frightening book, but it wasn't about any one particular thing. Skinner just came up with a bunch of examples. The whole point was that we mustn't take our social practices as given. Why shouldn't we experiment with them and see whether some work better over the long run than others? We should try out the variations. Selection, whether we're talking phylogeny, ontogeny, cultural practices, or sociogeny, in other words, selection will happen. So let's again and again. I guess I'm drumming this in a bit. By the way, it's going to come up in some of the future ones too. We have phylogenic selection, the Darwinian level, ontogenic selection at the operant level, cultural selection. I didn't actually update this slide. This one should have said sociogenic. I put in mimetic here, but that's like Dawkins. The trouble with memes is they're not very well defined. Now, I do want to make one point here that is crucial. Because these all involve selection, it doesn't mean they're all going to be consistent with each other. They can work together, and all three of them can go in the same direction, but some of them can oppose others. So, for example, consider the drug. If you've got a crack-addicted mother, and that's going to affect her fetus, then what you have going on is that the drug has served as a reinforcer for all of the behavior that led up to taking the drug. And that's ontogenic selection, but this is going to have deleterious effects with respect to the phylogenic level, in that the child may end up coming up with genetic issues and so forth. And there's also going to be other issues at the level of sociogenic levels, because there are going to be all kinds of social problems. If, for example, this particular mother is in a position where she ends up having to resort to crime in order to sustain her addiction. We can come up with dozens of examples. There are many. Smoking is another one we could have considered. The short-term effects are smoking is reinforcing. It's a powerful, very quick-acting reinforcer as soon as you inhale. But the long-term contingencies work against you, because you could end up with lung cancer. So anytime we write about or think about human origins, we've got to worry about all of these three levels working in different ways. We've got to take them into account. We've got to worry about the cases in which all three lead in the same direction, which must have happened at the level of verbal behavior. We needed to have the anatomy to be able to do the things we do when we talk, and we needed to have the opportunity for operant selection, and that our vocalizations had to be susceptible to operant selection, and they had to be passed on from some individuals to another, or there wouldn't be anything we call language. You can't have language with a single individual. Verbal behavior is social behavior too. So we've got all of these in our background, and we've got to keep in mind all of these other features of it. You cannot shape with a virtual aversive control. What punishment does is reduces the variations. It doesn't enhance them. We've got to worry about freedom. Freedom is the availability of alternatives. And so when we behavior analysts talk about least restrictive procedures, we mean not closing down the options. And we have long ago decided that that's what we ought to make one of our criteria for what is an acceptable application. It's got to be the least restrictive one with truth and disclosure. The truth may enhance options. If you lie, you're saying this is all you can do because that's what's going to happen. And when you look at tragedy, look what happened to Romeo and Juliet. If only Romeo and Juliet had told each other everything about the thing that was going to put them temporarily to sleep. Look what happened to Othello and Desdemona. Well, we can go through those kinds of things. It's often great tragedy involves somebody having not told somebody something else. And what that did was narrowed the options. Even with respect to verbal behavior, what we found about instructed behavior is it's less sensitive to contingencies. In other words, it's less variable than verbal behavior that has been directly shaped by the contingencies. Instruction tends to reduce variations, whereas behavior that's been shaped tends to increase them. So answer me a question about this then. Over to you, Marissa.
Alrighty, everybody. Variations are reduced rather than enhanced by, go ahead, select an answer, and I'll give you some time. All right, thank you all for voting. I will shut this down now. Cool. All right, looks like 15% say truth and disclosure, 60% say aversive control, 11% say shaping of novel behavior, and 13% say availability of options.
I'm surprised by that one. I would have thought it had come across more strongly that aversive control is the most powerful thing that reduces options. But okay, let's nevertheless move on because is there research on this? Well, yeah, there's all of Skinner's work on verbal governance and the research that's followed from it. Nate Azrin and many of his colleagues, Ron Hutchinson and others, have done extensive studies on aversive control, except that whole area of research has sort of become a bit stagnant. The problem of jumping through all sorts of hoops to get anything approved by research committees, and the emphasis on positive reinforcement has melted. There are still many things we don't know about how aversive control works, but it's harder and harder to do research on it. And it is possible to work with fairly innocuous aversive events like brief loud noise and so forth. So there are actually data that of all the topics that were available and people were researching back in the 50s, the one area in which the amount of research has drastically decreased over the decades is the area of aversive control. We have lots of research on the reinforcement of variation, and Alan Nurendra has related it to volition and questions of freedom. Marvelous stuff there. We'll talk about some of that in a little bit more length in a later webinar. I've done some work on preference for free choice over forced choice, and that's another thing that contributes to these arguments. If organisms in general prefer to have options, that's another thing that favors the variations over the stereotypy. And Sidman and many others have shown how through equivalence classes and other things, we have sources of novel behavior. So shaping itself is a way of producing novel behavior. So we now have a huge body of research. It's not just a matter of asserting that we can talk about these things. We have data showing that we can make situations more or less favorable to variations. So some of the implications for general ethical issues, you can shape using reinforcers. With a reinforcer, you reinforce this response, and what you get is not just that response, but a range of other responses that are similar to it. And by then picking extreme values of those, you can move it around. You can't do that using punishers. Punishers decrease responding that produce that particular event as a punishers. So they decrease the range of variations. I kind of like the term stopperance as the class that's eliminated by the aversive event. So if it is the case that the more variations you have, the better you're going to be able to deal with changing contingencies, then reinforcement ought to be preferable to punishers. And if making those populations more viable involves survival, then yeah, that should be an ethical imperative. The species that we find are most at risk are especially those who have come to be more and more specialized, because if the environment changes on those, they are less likely to be able to come up with variations that are going to adapt to these new environments. Now, there is actually lots of evidence now for this kind of these kinds of relations existing in biological systems. So, and this was mentioned in the at the beginning of this talk, and you'll find it in the abstract. Species, you might have these two species that are otherwise similar in phenotype. So let's say you have fish living in certain kinds of lakes in the Midwest, and these lakes are very similar. And because they've evolved in these very similar lakes, similar kinds of environments, their phenotype, their appearances to us as we find them, can be very similar. But we can also test their genes. And it is possible that two populations of fish who look similar to us and behave similarly might nevertheless differ in how variable the gene pool is. Those with the greater genetic diversity actually have advantages over the others, especially when the environment changes. So we have global warming, the weather changes, the salinity of these lakes, or the stuff that's washed into them from upstream. Various things about the lakes change, the average temperature changes. And so both of these populations of fish are stressed. And it turns out that the ones that have the wider gene pool, the more variable gene pool, are more likely to survive. They are likely to maintain their populations than the ones with the narrower. And these are just two examples. They go back a little bit. These kinds of papers now are being published all the time in the literature of conservation biology. And so we have data then that support this conclusion. The more variability, the more likelihood of survival at the level of phylogeny. So this is the conclusion, and that suggests that variation itself at the genetic level, as it is in the operant level. Remember, I told you about Alan Nurend's research, which shows that you can reinforce variation itself. It appears that that must be something that's been selected for over evolutionary time. Systems that generate more variations are more likely to proliferate than those that are very, very stereotyped, because sooner or later the stereotyped ones are going to run into an environment that doesn't support them. So the greater genetic diversity means selective advantages, especially in the face of changing environments. Well, okay, I've talked about phylogenetic selection, and I've talked about operant selection, and how about cultural diversity? How about this sociogenic level? The wider range of variations makes a population more viable. Species at risk are those in specialized environments, and they can exist at any level of selection, though they don't have to support each other. Remember, I talked about the drug dependency of the pregnant woman. as being reinforcement at the ontogenic level, but having problematic consequences at the phylogenic or sociogenic levels. So how about truth, honesty, civic virtues, all of these other kinds of things that we talk about at the level of culture? Well, I'd already suggested that that these things matter with respect to the survival of behavior if it's passed on. If capacities for variability, preferences for free choice, if phylogeny has selected those, then the environments that selected them or allowed them, the ones that are least restrictive, are those in which adaptive or reinforced variations are likely to emerge. I've already said truth, disclosure. It may seem like a stretch, but remember, I've already talked a bit about verbal governance. Verbally governed behavior is typically more constrained, less variable, more stereotyped than contingency-shaped behavior. So here again, this to me is a good time to ask another question. Here we go, Marissa.
Alrighty, everybody. So, the advantages of a variable gene pool have been demonstrated in. Go ahead and take some time to answer this.
So how are we doing here?
Awesome. Thank you all for voting. I'll shut this down in just about a second. Perfect. Thank you all. All right, looks like 20% say free choice experiments, 10% say studies of hidden costs of reward, 66% say conservation biology research, and 4% say evolution of religion.
Okay, now remember the free choice experiments were not about the phylogenic level. That was something that we demonstrated at the ontogenic level. So that one was in the same ballpark in that it does demonstrate the advantages of the variations, but not with respect to phylogeny. Anyway, that's the basis on which I asked that one. I'll have to rethink that one too. So, so moving on is I've already talked about whether there's relevant research and I guess this repeats an earlier slide. Or did I? Oh, wait a minute. I moved things. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Somehow okay. So we're now talking about variations in cultural selection and sociogeny. Sociogeny, by the way, it's a relatively recently used term. It nicely parallels in form phylogeny, ontogeny, sociogeny. It turns out that it was a word that once was around in the early part of the 20th century. However, it got a bad name because it was used by people who were trying to argue for eugenics. And those were the days in which there were people who were arguing that we should start controlling the gene pools and so forth. And sadly, some of that turned out to produce some pretty horrendous practices. But it's essentially been obsolete for all those time, and it worked so conveniently for us that maybe I shouldn't have even told you about its history. But anyway, let's get back to the selection of variations within cultural practices. Cultures that celebrate diversity may have some crucial advantages. Hitler tried to remove Jews and others from German culture. Hitler actually saw the United States as a model for what we did to our native populations in settling the West. And Hitler had read some of the social Darwinism, which talked about how you shouldn't be supporting some parts of the population, but in fact let them be selected. Nature is a competition. And actually, some of that history may be one source of the anti-Darwinism that's still around in some of contemporary culture. So we find when Barry Schwartz criticized Skinner's work, he also criticized Darwin. And but anyway, look at what happened to Hitler and the Nazi government. Um, yeah, it might have gone differently and it might have gone worse, but by doing that, by removing the variation in the German population, arguing for that white supremacy, that Aryan supremacy in those days, Einstein left, and many other talented physicists. And if he had not done that, we might have not been in such a favorable position as to come out winning the Second World War and getting rid of Nazi Germany and the concentration camps, and so on. The, the, the countries that allowed for more variations in their democracies ended up faring better than the ones that were monolithic in the kinds of behavior they would allow. There were also stories back then of during World War II. At first, the U.S. military didn't do very well. It didn't have a lot of experience fighting major wars. But one of the things that happened was that the way things worked with American troops was they could improvise in the face of unanticipated contingencies, whereas in the other military, they were rigidly supposed to follow orders. The Russians and the Germans, or the Soviets and the Germans, faced off on the Eastern Front during World War II. And in both cases, they just had massive casualties. And part of that was uh, not variable. They learned techniques, of course, but actually the practices that the Soviets engaged in then were very similar in some ways to the practices that the Russians are engaging in the war in the Ukraine. And although the Ukrainians are not doing as well as we might hope, they are certainly doing unexpectedly well. And part of it is that they do have more variations available in their tactics. So the idea was allow troops the variations. Patton was quoted as saying, if you want to get the job done, just tell them what needs to be done. Don't tell them how to do it. And the idea there was let them come up with the variations that will work. Let them learn the different kinds of things. And so Patton then was very successful in conducting the military on the Western Front during World War II against the German army after the D-Day invasion and the movement through toward Berlin. Look at Mao and the cultural revolution and his proteges, Cambodia and North Korea, and look at the rigidity of Leninist and Stalinist states. Look at the practices of Islamic fundamentalist organizations and other totalitarian regimes. We can talk about their suppressing freedom, but for us, I think the most important reason to care is that they are suppressing the variations. They are limiting the individual behavior in certain ways. People are not allowed to talk about certain things. They're not allowed to do certain things. Their individual behavior is shaped by practices that involve aversive contingencies. And I am still optimistic enough to guess that it's our pool of variable behavior at the social level, people doing all kinds of things and all kinds of bargains. Our great advantage is our diversity. And those who try to subvert it, whether they're white supremacists or politicians who are taking a certain view that has unfortunately persisted since the rolling back of Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War, are in fact damaging our culture. And they're causing conflicts, and it's something that we have to overcome. And we've got to do it not just with aversive techniques, we've got to do it with techniques that will support populations and keep things moving. That's why I think it's so important to get our stuff out there. Mao, what he did, he would occasionally loosen things up. he said he'd allow 1,000 flowers to bloom, and all of the people came up and they started to talk about some different things they could do. But once they came up with those different ways, he then that was simply a way of getting those people to come back out and make themselves public. And once he did that, he then um, uh, persecuted those populations of people. So even after a period in which you allowed variations and then you destroyed the variations, what he did was creating a culture in which even when you try to loosen things up with a thaw in those practices, people worry that it might be just a temporary thing just to make people reveal themselves. So there are lots of ways in which cultures limit variations: by prohibitions, by diet, by marriage, by verbal behavior, through verbal behavior. They prohibit blasphemy, they prohibit heresy. You can't say certain things in certain communities. Some places, blasphemy or heresy gets you the death penalty. You cannot make certain kinds of images, and you will destroy those that you find made by others. You will limit social practices. Yeah, we have problems. We have huge problems. We still have de facto segregation in many parts of the country, and the heritage of a period of time during which redlining and other practices limited where people could live and who they could have as their neighbors. And we have all kinds of other prejudicial practices, and they persist within our culture. There's no question about that. But still, compare us with much of the rest of the world. Europe is now far better than it used to be. But start looking at the rest of the world, and you see that despite all of our problems, we still represent some of these things. I wish it were better, but actually, as I recall my own history, I can remember the era of what we called McCarthyism back in the 50s. In the 50s, when I was during the summer after my junior year in high school, I'd been a math major, and I came back to my high school ready to take courses in math that were going to include calculus in my senior year, and all of our math faculty was gone. That's because Joe McCarthy, the chair of the House Un-American Activities Committee, had set things up so people had to take loyalty pledges, and that entire math faculty was gone, and it was and in its place were new teachers who had never taught these advanced courses at the high school level. That probably did affect. Of course, I ended up in behavior analysis. I was probably, and I hope I'm a better behavior analyst than I would have been a mathematician. But those kinds of things happened within our own culture in those days, in the 50s. They seemed horrendous at the time. In the 1960s, we had all of the problems with respect to the divisions in the country, with respect to the Vietnam War. And many of those divisions, many of the seeds of those divisions were planted in those times too. So we have gone through periods of crisis before. This one in some ways seems worse than some of the past ones, but let's work as behavior analysts together to see how we can get through them. Write the letters to the editor where you see that they can help people to learn about what we do. Yeah, we have been sluggish in dealing with crises like climate change, with epidemics, with technological catastrophes, terrorism, but I still think we're likely to do better than cultures that suppress variations, and therefore are less able to create the human resources that will cope with such problems. Variations are what we are good at. Diversity really, really matters, and let's promote it in whatever ways we can. I'm not going to try to say which political affiliations are most consistent with diversity. I think it's easy enough for you to figure it out. Probably you already have. But there are other problems, other things we don't understand a lot about. As behavior analysts, we should do more to address the effects of role models, charismas. When political talk sets the examples for violence and for prejudice and for divisions, we've got to figure out how that works. If what we do is relevant, the survival of our science and its technology is going to depend on how well we can create successful variations, especially in each new generation our students. But I need feedback. So now it's time for discussions of questions. So first, one more for you folks. Marissa.
Alrighty, everybody. Please choose one of the following. Do you have no questions at all? You got one, or you got more than one? Go ahead and lock in your answer for this last poll.
And of course, if you have the questions, write them in and send them up. I will try to take as many as I can.
Alrighty, everybody. Thank you all for voting. I'm going to shut it down. If you start having questions, go ahead and start putting them into the questions box while I start reading off the results. Looks like, oh wow, looks like 83% of people don't have any questions. 8% have one, and 8% have more than one.
Okay. By the
Awesome.
way, he's holding a pigeon in case you don't recognize him.
Alrighty. Thank you all for voting. And if you didn't purchase your CEUs as of yet, that is okay. Go ahead, do it overnight if you want instant access to your certificate tomorrow when I send those instructions. Otherwise, you can just purchase and then follow those instructions. Just kind of do it in like a reverse order than the email says. But go ahead, put your questions in the questions box. If you wanted to see the recording, it will be available in a few hours. Use the the registration link that's on the product page. You used it to sign up. If you use the join webinar button from those emails that you get reminding you to join the webinar, it's going to tell you that the webinar is over. So please use that registration link. That's the difference there. Okay, let's see. Getting a couple of some feedback in here. I want to ask him, what do you think of countries like India? We have little to no training or education institution devoted purely for ABA.
Yeah, we are limited in what our access is. There are some people from India who are familiar. We do have occasional people from India who I've seen or heard about who occasionally uh, take some of our courses. So a little bit will filter through there. It's an enormous population. In fact, it's at this point growing so much that the population of India is soon going to overtake China's. And at least it has enough variation in still having elections that there might be more opportunities for change there. But uh, what will make a big difference there is going to be how India can educate its population, which is so huge. um, we do know that some of behavior analysis is getting into China, because I do know of some students from China who have gotten degrees in behavior analysis programs in the United States and then returned to China. Given the huge numbers, you know, when you're talking about billions of people, um, that's a kind of thing that's it's like a large ship in the ocean. You can't change its direction very quickly. So I think we have to also keep in mind what's manageable. We at least know we might have some small impacts in our own culture. And I think we also have to take advantage of opportunities as they come up. You know, if you have colleagues who are international colleagues who you're going to be working with and you run into and who are going to be here for a while and are going back to some other country, yeah, try to leave them with something they'll take back with them. Um, we've also got immediate problems. We've got the questions of what climate change is going to do to our country and to other countries as social systems get more stressed by the problems that creates. Um, it's countries like India and countries in that area where populations are going to be more vulnerable to climate change, that things could change drastically very quickly and more quickly than even than here. So It's a great question. I'm not trying to diminish its significance, but as I look at the things around, I think we just have to be pleased we can make our small changes. And for me, um, I started out as an undergraduate when there were just a handful of universities that even had courses based on what we now call behavioral analysis. And by the time I was just starting out in the field, and I would go to a professional meeting, and it would often be a regional meeting rather than a national one. There wasn't any national organization at that time. The national organizations like the American Psychological Association would have just a couple of sessions in the entire meeting in which people we now label as behavior analysts would give their talks, and you'd go to a regional meeting, and you'd know just about everybody. As a student, I didn't necessarily talk to everybody, but there was a certain group of names, and you become pretty much familiar. Now you go to a meeting, and there are thousands upon thousands of people. So when I see the extent to which what we do has grown over time, I'm impressed and heartened by that. And if we continue at that same rate, we will certainly become more and more effective. Um, I also hear that in some other countries, behavior analysis is growing faster even than it is in this country. Brazil has a very, very substantial number of behavior analysts, and I'm curious as to whether how its numbers compare with the numbers in the United States. So be heartened by the fact that we have continued to grow. We are continuing to turn out students at the master's level and at the doctoral level. Doctoral programs now are increasing, and I'm also heartened when I look at the things that come up on the listservs announcing a position that's opened here or opened there. Yes, we hope we can do better, but at least we're increasing in numbers, and that means that we're probably increasing in impact. So I still dare to be optimistic, even though there's so many things out there that are going on that we could be pessimistic about. So keep up the good stuff, and let's try to keep up what we're doing. The alternative is just to throw up our hands and stop doing it. And I don't see that. We know where that's going to lead. So let's do the best we can. Any other
Uh,
questions?
yeah, there are just a couple more. If you wanted, if you had another meeting or something to go to, you are free to go. You still will meet your CEU hours. However, we'll continue just a couple more questions for Q&A, since there's just a couple in the box. Let's see. Let's do. I know of two programs in India that are training BCBAs. That's awesome.
Okay,
Um,
that's thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah.
yeah. That came from Steve from us. So actually we're probably working with them. So at least we're reaching tons of people across the world. Um,
Mhm.
so let's see. Oh, thank you for your time, Dr. Catania. I was a student of Phil Heinlein's and would love to hear a verse of behavior side story.
Oh, good grief. Oh my. Yeah, behavior side story, for those of you who don't know about it, was a story of this young cognitive psychologist named Tony, who was coming under the influence of the master named Mastermind Chomsky, and he meets a young gal named Maria who is already on the behavior side. And the question is whether Tony is going to be drawn over from the cognitive side to the behavior side, which makes it behavior side story. And if you note any relationship between that and West Side Story, well, yeah, you're being perceptive. Um, well, Maria at one point sings a song about reinforcement, and Phil would be appalled if he knew I was going to try to do this, because Phil has absolute pitch and I don't. So I can claim some responsibility for the lyrics, but then, and we don't even have we had a music minus one version of the show to do this at an ABBA meeting, in which we did most of the numbers in West Side Story in their behavioral translations. But one of them is Maria singing. I'm going to have to try. Reinforcements, not a theory. It's what theory must clearly explain. Dump the theory. The phenomenon will still remain. Reinforcements, controversial to their mindset. It has no appeal. They won't try it, so they hardly can believe it's real. And I got to stop at that point. Tony is sufficiently taken in by Maria that he eventually does come around and he sings behavior, 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 the most powerful word I ever heard. Behavior, 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 behavior. Say it loud and there's no escaping. Say it soft and it's almost like shaping. Behavior. I'll never stop saying behavior, the most powerful word I ever heard. Behavior. Apologies, Phil, should you ever watch this. But that'll have to be my answer to that question. Thank you, folks.
Alrighty, thank you for that. Let's see. Why is the complexity of human differences bring out anger and hate towards others?
Oh my goodness, that's too much of us. Say that one again. Could you repeat?
Yeah, I deleted it a little bit, but I think it was how does the complexity um I'm so sorry, I can't remember now. Bring out hate in others. Um, can you resubmit
Well,
your
let's.
question? So sorry, I deleted it as I was deleting a couple of others.
I think I got enough of it, and I think I can say a little bit because it's clearly a question we can't give any final answer to. I talked a little bit in the discussion and the conversation about emotions. Hate is a very special kind of a thing to talk about, and what especially seems to characterize it, it's being in a condition in which the reinforcer is hurting other people. And usually that is engendered by circumstances in which one is under aversive circumstances oneself. Ron Hutchinson did a whole series of experiments demonstrating that, for example, pigeons switch from reinforcement to extinction during the time when their behavior is now being extinguished. Behavior is not producing the reinforcers it used to produce. That's when a pigeon will go over and attack a model pigeon. Um, um, uh, so the behavior that we see as having those characteristics usually tell us that there's something aversive going on with respect to the individual who's engaging in it. And that may be one reason why when you have conditions of economic stress, that there's a lot more crime, hate crime, because these are people who are living under aversive circumstances and it makes hurting other individuals more reinforcing. Now, that doesn't explain anything. When you're under aversive circumstances, so if you're deprived of reinforcers, it's important, it's often that others are taking them over, so attacking others may have a benefit. If you're being injured in some way, then maybe if you attack the nearest organism, it's the one that's hurting you. So there may be an evolutionary source of that sort of thing. So getting rid of aversive stuff should reduce hate. And those who build it up also are building up on other social things. Maybe that's another topic we have to get to. I don't have it in the list of stuff coming up. But what I'm mainly willing to say about that here, and I know I can't give any kind of final example, is it is a thing that we label as behavior, and we behavior analysts ought to then spend some time worrying about where all that comes from. And unfortunately, this movement of not doing research on aversive control and on the things that might engender that kind of behavior disadvantages us because we just don't know enough about it. So I'd rather get back to the world of uh, uh, finding behavior itself appealing. And so let's close on that happier note, but without forgetting the message about those other dimensions that we definitely need to deal with, because they're creating. We know they are part of the source of the problems that we're dealing with politically and in the world at large. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to continuing the conversations, and welcome any of you to come back and watch any of these as BDS makes them repeatedly available. Thank you, BDS, for giving me the opportunity to do these.
Of course. Thank you so much, Charlie, for doing them. And thank you, everybody, for attending them to make them actually possible. Without you, obviously, we would have no webinars to do. Um, so thank you, thank you, thank you. If you guys have any questions, feel free to send them over to support. We can forward them over. Go ahead, buy those CEUs if you haven't already. Just a little reminder, your certificates will come tomorrow before lunchtime. But if you only need a certificate of completion, that is free and will come in just a few hours automatically in an email that has the subject line, "Thank you for attending." Um, and yeah, I think that's kind of it for now. We'll see you next time. Go sign up for next month. And actually, the rest of the year is already posted in our webinar calendar. So you can sign up for the rest of the year so far. And we'll be releasing the first quarter pretty soon as well. But have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much, Charlie.
Thank you. Bye bye, everybody. Take care. Stay safe.